Hello, everyone. This is uh, something that I wrote and was writing it as a closing argument. But I felt that it was necessary to get it said. Officer Chauvin's case is God's mirror to America. Grossly negligent acts by professionals who have qualified immunity should meet the element for criminal intent needed to convict officers like Officer Chauvin of murder. You can't be paid by the state, protected by the state, grossly negligent, and not be held to a higher standard for your acts than unsworn citizens. Haven't we convicted drunk drivers of murder? Or do officers get a special pass when their actions or inactions cause death? If officers need more training, why didn't Officer Chauvin listen to the emergency medical technician, the EMT, and the MMA fighter who has more training than him in either keeping people alive or knocking people out? It's because police officers don't have to listen to anyone except other police officers. They don't have to respect you if you don't have a badge, and they don't have to listen to you if you don't have a gun, and they don't have to advocate for you if they don't want to. They don't have to listen to the experts with more training than you. They don't have to listen to the public and bystanders who wanted George Floyd to be safe. Police officers are supposed to protect the public, and the public clearly let them know that they felt safe, but they feared for the safety of George Floyd. It's what would Jesus do, not what would Jesus do if he was a police officer. If Jesus knelt on George Floyd's neck until George Floyd was incapacitated and dead, would Jesus be wrong? Would Jesus have knelt on George Floyd's neck in the first place? Let's say Jesus would have. Would it be reasonable for Jesus to act that way? And if Jesus acted like Officer Chauvin or our law enforcement in general, will we still believe in it? You may think it's an odd comparison, but when you have the power to save life and to cause death, you would be scrupulously careful when you step in and do God's job for him. Officer Chauvin had the power to remove his weight from George Floyd's body. He had the power to call an ambulance before he thought George Floyd went into cardiac arrest. He had the power to let George Floyd lay on the ground handcuffed. He had the power to use discretion and make George Floyd return any items that he had bought with that $20 bill. But Officer Chauvin allowed his weight to cause George Floyd's death. There's no need to talk about the barbaric war on drugs in the midst of a pandemic and opioid crisis. We don't have to talk about that because that all contributed to George Floyd's death. It was Officer Chauvin's need for absolute submission and control of a nonviolent person, of a nonviolent George Floyd. That's what killed George Floyd. Officer Chauvin's disregard for public safety killed George Floyd. How are you killing people that you're supposed to protect? George Floyd deserved protection as a victim of America's opioid crisis. George Floyd deserved protection as a victim of America's mental health crisis. George Floyd deserved protection from the responding officers. George Floyd deserved protection from the fellow officers who didn't and couldn't protect George Floyd from Officer Chauvin, who had either gone rogue, fearful, excessive, and/or stupid. George Floyd died of a heart attack. Okay, that's what you want to say, but who caused it? Did Officer Chauvin intend to kill George Floyd? Probably not. But he intended to force George Floyd into full submission. Full submission, even if that meant that George Floyd went into cardiac arrest from panic, drugs, or asphyxiation. Officer Chauvin had the power to intentionally prevent it. Officer Chauvin intentionally ignored the pleas an order from a certified emergency health professional. If Officer Chauvin's job is to keep the public safe, it was the EMT's job to keep people alive. Why call an ambulance when you already have an ambulance worker there screaming at you to check George Floyd's pulse? At that moment, she wasn't fearing for her life. So Officer Chauvin shouldn't have feared for his either. But rather, she feared for George Floyd's life. Should Officer Chauvin feared a man that was laid prone on his stomach who was handcuffed? Officer Chauvin intentionally ignored the pleas and assessment of a professional fighter. If Officer Chauvin's job is to take down bad guys, it was that brother's job to take down professionally trained MMA fighters whose entire bodies are deadly weapons. Why review use of force when someone who gets paid to use force is telling you you're doing too much? These were two people with more training in the two areas that caused George Floyd's life to be taken. Officer Chauvin intentionally ignored every expert present. Officer Chauvin's actions said, F those kids. I don't care if they're getting ready to watch this barbaric act of 3 police officers laying on this man and utilizing their weight on this man and subduing this man and ultimately killing this man. The cold part is George Floyd asked to be laid on the ground, and Officer Chauvin obliged. Officer Chauvin had control over the entire situation. George Floyd deserved an advocate from the responding officers. You know, Officer Chauvin suspected that George Floyd was on something. So he approached him fearful of superhuman strength and an elevated state or heart rate, both of which Officer Chauvin couldn't and didn't see. He didn't see George Floyd utilize superhuman strength, and he didn't see what was going on with George Floyd's breathing and his heart. As strong as drugs may make you, I've yet to see anyone break through a set of handcuffs, steel handcuffs. Officer Chauvin couldn't see George Floyd's elevated heart rate and didn't check his elevated heart rate even after the EMT asked him to. But he clearly saw George Floyd's nervousness and anxiety turn into fear and panic. So is Officer Chauvin allowed to act in that manner without any repercussions? We heard on the videotape that George Floyd said, "I'm dead." How did George Floyd know that he was dead? And Officer Chauvin didn't. Doesn't Officer Chauvin have more training than George Floyd? How does a man that's supposedly a drug addict know that he's dead before someone who has a power of life and death on their hip? But Officer Chauvin has more training than George Floyd. So he ignored what he said. Because if Officer Chauvin wanted George Floyd to be dead, he would be. And as a result, George Floyd is. Officer Chauvin had a gun, a baton, and police physical combat training. That makes it possible. And that possibility of death occurred. Officer Chauvin didn't wake up that morning with the thought he was going to kill somebody that day, but he did kill someone. He didn't start his shift thinking he was going to kill someone over enforcement of counterfeit currency, but he did. Officer Chauvin didn't believe his knee on George Floyd's upper abdominal area, would kill him, but it did. Officer Chauvin made intentional choices and decisions. Did Officer Chauvin intend to put his own safety and health at risk over $20? No, but it comes with the job. If it's his job to do those kinds of things, then you're responsible for doing those things, for how you respond to those things. Everything that you do is intentional because it is your job. You can't be held responsible for causing excited delirium or a heart attack. And then you can't be held responsible for not listening to a medical professional. You didn't intend to kill him, but you intended to ignore a professional trying to keep George Floyd alive. If Jesus was a police officer, would he have done what Derek Chauvin did?